you joining us for the fourth day of our CEPAD webinars. Before we start with what proves to be a really interesting session, I'm really looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say. I wanted to formally announce the creation of a new award. Some of you may have seen on Twitter, some of you may have heard anecdotally or through various networks that one of our CEPAD PhD fellows recently passed away, very sadly, very suddenly. It's taken many of us by shock. It's really hit us hard. And what we thought we would do is name an award after her. So unfortunately, Abir Shaban passed away a couple of weeks ago. She's going to be sorely missed, both in Lancaster and in CEPAD. She was a huge advocate of what we were trying to do in CEPAD. I know that she was really looking forward to this session, which spoke directly to her research. She was looking at the transformation of the Mutawali in Lebanon, trying to understand the processes through which this group was transformed into a member of the Shia community. So she was fascinated by that. She was fascinated in questions of identity, of sectarianism, and she'd only spent about 6 months working on her PhD, but had made wonderful strides. Aside from that, though, I think the biggest imprint that Abir has left on certainly my life and the lives of others is her love of the academy and scholarship and the academic community. She was a regular contributor to anything that was happening in the department and in CEPAD. And so we wanted to do something to remember her and to commemorate what it was that she was trying to do. So after conversations with other members of CEPAD, the academics and PhD fellows, we thought that a nice thing to do would be to create an award, the Abir Shaban Award, which we will launch today. I'm going to ask for calls for nominations for the person who has done the most work to really try and engender a spirit of academic community, a spirit of community amongst scholars working in Middle Eastern studies. Ideally, this person should be an early career researcher, but the most important thing is that it's designed to reflect and pay homage to someone who's doing above and beyond to bring people together, to inspire them, to try and bring people together and do really important, interesting academic work, but something that represents and reflects humanity and people. And these were values that Abir held dearly, and I believe that some of her family might be here for this as well. So I really want them to know that we miss Abir dearly, we respect her a great deal, and we hope that this award will just help to make sure that she's not forgotten by those working in Middle Eastern studies. So I'll put some more information about this on the CEPAD website. We're going to award the prize at some point in the summer. There will be a book prize. There'll be some money to go towards that. And we just wanted it to be something that can remember Abir. She will be remembered by us. We will not forget her, and this award will just hopefully commemorate her in a way that pays respect to what she was trying to do. So thank you very much, Iyad. I just wanted to let people know about that and say, Abir, we miss you, and thank you for everything.
Yes, thanks a lot, Simon, for your words. Actually, as someone who shared an office with Abir for 6 months, I learned a lot from Abir on a personal level and also on the intellectual one. She will be a great loss, but however, her memory shall be always, over here and surrounding us. So we start our session today at the project of sectarianism, proxies, and desectarianization at Lancaster University, CEPAD. Our fourth webinar will discuss issues of conceptualizations of desectarianization. So how we could conceptualize desectarianization in the Middle East. Will be, I'm Iyad Rifai. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Iyad Rifai. I'm a PhD student at Lancaster University. I study regional system and as well as the identity struggles in the Middle East. I'm also a teaching assistant at the Political Science Department at the University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. With me today on the panel will be John Nagle. I'll introduce each panelist firstly, and then they shall introduce their paper or their work. So to cut the time, instead of introducing everyone twice. So John will present firstly, therefore I'll introduce John. John is a professor of sociology at Queen's University of Belfast. He received his PhD in anthropology from Queen's University as well. He was then appointed to many positions, among them at the Institute of Irish Study at Queen's and at the United Nations Research Center for Study of Conflict at the University of Ulster, and was appointed as well as a lecturer at the University of East London and as a reader in sociology at the University of Aberdeen. John has also been a visiting research fellow at the Exeter Center for Ethnopolitical Studies at the University of Exeter, and a visiting professor of sociology at the United Arab Emirates University. He has published 5 books and a number of articles in leading international journals. John's current research focuses on the role of social movement activism in divided societies, particularly in Lebanon and Northern Ireland. In this, he examines how a range of non-sectarian movements, including LGBTQ movements, feminists, and class-based groups mobilized for inclusion or challenge power-sharing structures in divided society, mainly in Lebanon and Northern Ireland. John has an extensive bio, so without further ado, please, to you, John.
Okay, thank you, Ian and Simon. Can you see my screen with my PowerPoint?
Yes, yes.
Great. How long have we got here?
15 to 20 minutes, please.
15 to 20 minutes, okay, yeah. So when I get to 15, please tell me to prepare to shut up. All right, so my presentation is some thoughts on desectarianism. So what I'm planning to do is a bit of a tour of a horizon of ways in which we can think about desectarianization. So some theories, some kind of ideas about kind of conceptualizing this, and also to think about how this may lead to kind of policy change and so on. All right. So to begin with, if I can be devil's advocate and to ask, I think a really important question is sectarianism bad? And I think there's actually some interesting argument to say, well, not necessarily. We need to kind of provide this in a kind of wider kind of context. So kind of 2 arguments can be made against the idea that sectarianism is bad. One is the so-called ontological realist debate, and that's just basically that we understand that sectarian identities can be constructed, but once they're constructed, especially in the context of kind of conflict and civil war, they can become quite fixed, and therefore they're not kind of biodegradable, and we need to think about how these identities can be accommodated within public institutions such as consociational power sharing and so on. And actually this kind of ontological realist perspective may lead to desectarianism in the long run if we think about the process of accommodating sectarian identities within power sharing. The kind of process of kind of elite level kind of cooperation between sectarian elites will eventually lead to the building of trust and therefore the amelioration of sectarian identities. Secondly, you can actually argue that desectarianization is actually a counterproductive discourse, especially when you have Western, and I hate to use kind of word kind of Western as some sort of homogenous kind of entity, but especially when kind of Western actors talk about desectarianization as the kind of end goal or kind of teleological kind of process in which states should work towards. You know, sectarian states are supposed to kind of move through a process of modernization and become liberal democratic states like us. For me, that's an extremely kind of counterproductive kind of discourse, because that can be used by sectarian elites to kind of, you know, protect their own power by saying, well, you know, desectarianization is basically just a Western-led sort of kind of process to kind of, you know, undermine us. So before we kind of even move on towards desectarianization, I think it's important for us to consider what may be not necessarily good about sectarianization, but is it always necessarily the kind of end goal of any sort of academic, scholarly, or policy approach? All right. However, if we do kind of accept that we need to move towards desectarianization, it's important to kind of consider the main critiques. So I think there's kind of three main kind of critiques. The first one, obviously, is a very obvious point. I don't think anybody supports the idea of sectarian antagonism or the idea that sectarian groups are inherently kind of monolithic kind of entities or whatever. So, I mean, that's basically an obvious point. Secondly, a bit more kind of complicated is zombification, and I think this is one of the main critiques of sectarianism. So, you know, societies divided by sectarian division are characterized by instability, low levels of economic growth, and all of this is kind of reinforced by corruption and clientelism. The third kind of critique, and I think this is a critique which needs to be taken on board a bit more, in my humble opinion, is that we often kind of look at intergroup relationships between sectarian groups, you know, Sunni, Shia, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, but we don't actually look at what's going on within these kind of groups themselves. And actually, you may actually find multiple forms of inequality within sectarian groups. So these kind of inequalities could include inequalities between men and women, between socioeconomic groups, or even in the sense that sectarian systems can exclude some minority groups, whether it's refugees and so on. And as I say, I think it's actually one of our major kind of blind spots of research and sectarianization, is to constantly look at intergroup rather than intragroup relationships. And this is something I'm looking at the moment. So, for example, looking at some public survey data in Lebanon, is showing actually when you have a look at within groups, say for example the Shia population, there's actually substantial differences between men and women in terms of how they view issues to do with trust in government, in terms of the performance of kind of power sharing and so on. So, you know, to kind of move a debate on, it's not just relationships between groups, but relationships within groups which need to be considered. So even if we want to kind of move towards desectarianization, and we kind of support groups who have that objective in mind, we need to be cognizant of the fact that change is extremely hard. And there's a number of reasons why kind of change is bloody hard for sectarian actors. And that's because sectarian systems are actually really incredibly successful in terms of what they do. And what I mean by successful is that they kind of protect the kind of, you know, the logic of the sectarian system really well. So change is hard because, as Janine Clark and Bazel Saluk have shown, that sectarian systems often have these kind of path-dependent characteristics. So they have deeply entrenched structural and agential barriers which prohibit the capacity for non-sectarian movements to achieve objectives. So the sectarian system is very good at closing down any actors who try to achieve rights or transformation, or even sectarian actors are very good at kind of co-opting non-sectarian actors. Secondly, the idea of symbolic power and violence, more broadly, the work of Pierre Bourdieu, is that we can see sectarianism as having this immense symbolic power which can obscure profound processes of inequality and domination. So, you know, sectarian systems can become incredibly hegemonic, which makes it very difficult for actors to achieve change. thirdly, with a nod to kind of Simon, work on Agamben, sectarian elites are very good at creating states of exception when challenges come to the fore, or challenges to the sectarian system become very quickly framed as threats to stability and security, and non-sectarian actors often find themselves placed within that state of exception. So change is incredibly hard to move. All right, so kind of moving on. When we kind of think about movements which are aiming for desectarianization, I think it's important to kind of bear in mind that there's lots of different types of kind of actors who are looking to achieve some form of desectarianization. So it's a very sort of heterogeneous kind of field. And I've got kind of three kind of broad categories of movements who in different ways try to promote desectarianization. So the first one I think would be transformationists. So these are non-sectarian actors who try to transform sectarian societies into non-sectarian societies. So examples of this could be secularists, which we saw in Lebanon a few years ago, such as like Pride. They want to kind of completely eradicate the sectarian system in Lebanon. Another example of this could be labor movements. So they would argue that sectarian kind of group identities can be overcome by promoting unified class encapsulations. So the idea here is that, you know, we can promote kind of class-based politics, which will overcome sectarianism. So sectarianism is a form of false consciousness. However, transformationists are rarely kind of successful because sectarian elites quickly work out what we're up to, and these kind of movements can be quickly closed down. So the second type of movement, what I call communists. So communists are non-sectarian actors which try to promote momentary intercommunal unity on certain issues which affect all groups. So for example, housing tenants protesting over public rent, rallies against privatization of public services, student protests, protests over urban regeneration, protests over corruption, for example. So these movements aren't necessarily kind of promoting the transformation of the sectarian system, but I think importantly what they do is they create battle lines, these kind of battle lines in which, you know, the sectarian system can be fought along kind of multiple kind of points and weaknesses. So the third type of desectarianization movements, I think, would be pluralists. So pluralists are non-sectarian actors who feel that their kind of identities have traditionally been excluded within the context of a sectarian system. So they're trying to kind of pluralize society, make it more open and aware of multiple intersecting identities, such as gender equality, issues to do with kind of sexual difference, and even kind of anti-racist mobilizations. So, as I'm saying, I think, you know, there's not one single unified actor when we talk about desectarianization. There's different types. Some of them may kind of overlap in regards to these categories. Now, the kind of tactics of desectarianization movements. This is something I'm increasingly becoming interested in. What tactics are more successful in trying to challenge and transform and change the system? So first, which is most obvious, which is working inside the system. So that's groups try to form into maybe kind of political parties, more kind of formal organizations which try to work within the political system. That's pretty unrealistic, to be honest, within sectarian systems, because the formal system is so weak that it's pretty much impossible for non-sectarian actors to gain any sort of, you know, foothold within the system. So, you know, looking at Lebanon, Paul Kingston wrote this book, I think kind of 10, 15 years ago, about non-sectarian actors, and he said, we basically can't achieve anything. And within the time from Paul Kingston writing that book to now, exactly the same situation is in place. I think there's hardly been one sort of policy past in relationship to issues about gender, whatever, in Lebanon. So secondly, opposing the system. You know, for people who want to overthrow the system, this is a chant we often hear within societies which have sectarian forms of governance. Great idea, all of us kind of support this, but, you know, this makes us ask you, who are the people? And of course, trying to oppose the system often legitimates the state of exception. So the sectarian elites, you know, very quickly bring in the army, security forces on the basis of trying to protect security and stability. And this is something we often see in Lebanon, of course. So the third one, which I think is more interesting, is a kind of war of terrain. These are kind of intersectional kind of struggles. So we could draw on, you know, obviously the work of kind of Gramsci and some others. So these are kind of battle lines over the hegemony of the system. So instead of thinking about, you know, trying to overthrow the system working within, this is working along the multiple battle lines, the weaknesses of the system itself. So struggles for, you know, against racism, for class-based economic redistribution, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, rights for refugees and migrant populations. I think these are really kind of major when we think about it in terms of what they accumulate to in relationship to challenging the grammar that sustains sectarianism. And often, you know, the system doesn't actually really understand what's going on here because there's so many kind of different struggles, and often they kind of interact and kind of come together at certain points. So I think that sort of struggle, in my humble opinion, is actually quite powerful. All right, I'm going to try and finish off with a couple of slides here. And this is kind of where I'm going with in terms of some of my research, and that's trying to analyze the outcome of non-sectarian movements, because we want to believe that the struggles of these non-sectarian movements is actually going somewhere. It's not enough to just examine how these groups mobilize, but what kind of tactics they use. But what I want to know is, what sort of change do they actually affect in the medium to long term? Because, as I keep saying, sectarian systems are incredibly resilient and hard, and change is amazingly hard to achieve. So I think in terms of analysing outcomes, we need to move away from looking at policy change, because, as I mentioned earlier, it's impractical for non-sectarian actors to work within the system to affect policy change. You know what I mean? So if we just focus on what sort of policy change non-sectarian actors achieve, it's a pretty kind of limiting analytical framework. So perhaps in terms of looking at change, and once again, a nod to Simon and the Gambon. And this is something we've been looking at in terms of the CPAD reading group, is destituent effects. I'm not going to go into Gambon's theories of destituent power at the moment, because, you know, firstly, I don't want to bore anybody, but it's so complicated. But, you know, I think one of the interesting things about this is how movements can deactivate and render inoperative the power of the sectarian system at particular moments. So that's how, you know, women and sexual minorities may not necessarily kind of achieve rights, but ensure the system doesn't work in a way which negatively impacts upon those particular identity groups. Another way is to, secondly is cognitive liberation. So this is a social movement idea from Doug McAdam. And cognitive liberation is the process through which individuals begin to recognize that the system is unjust and there's somebody to blame for their situation. They know who's to blame, and therefore they begin to create change in that way. So I think looking at ideas about to what extent non-sectarian movements can create attitudinal transformation amongst the population. And to go back to Lebanon, without pretending to be an expert or say that I claim to know how people think in Lebanon, but I think that's one of the really kind of successful kind of aspects of non-sectarian activism in the last few years, is getting ordinary people to kind of understand, you know, the nature of the kind of system and to be aware of how unjust it is. All right, finally, this is an area which I think needs a bit more research, and if anybody could help me, I'd be eternally grateful. What conditions are best for allowing non-sectarian movements to move towards achieving change? Are there kind of certain kind of context conditions in which non-sectarian actors are more likely to create transformation and to work towards desectarianization? So firstly, what political opportunity structures are there? Are there any kind of structural conditions which are favourable for different campaigns and for different movements? There's a lot of talk about economics these days, you know, that economic collapse, decline or whatever may be favourable to non-sectarian movements. However, I'd be quite wary of that because it can work both ways. It's a very kind of curvilinear kind of process. Declining standards does not always necessarily lead to kind of positive non-sectarian movement change. It can actually work the other way. Secondly, conditions for change is the weakening power of external actors. We know that external actors often support sectarian systems. So changes within the relationships between external actors or the relationship between external actors and sectarian systems, of course, may provide new opportunities. And thirdly, and finally, to quote from Leonard Cohen, there's a crack in everything, that's where the light gets in. So no matter how much we often kind of think of sectarian systems as being very monolithic, all powerful and so on, as I've tried to kind of stress in this kind of short presentation, there's so many cracks, weaknesses within the system. And the question is how these non-sectarian movements can take advantage of these weaknesses. All right, that's me. Done, finished.
Thank you very much, John. Excellent presentation, actually. And if really they can take advantage of these weaknesses or not, this is a great question to pose to civil society movements and other movements as well. Our second presenter today is Emanuelle Esposti. I hope I'm not butchering this. She is a current research and outreach associate at the Center of Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge, a specialist in the politics and emotion of minority identities. Emanuelle received her PhD in politics and international studies from SOAS School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Her current research examines the public forms of activism undertaken by 12 Shia Muslims in Europe, especially those that might be said to be geared towards the cultivation of a European Shiism, as well as exploring the way in which Shia communities view and understand themselves. Her projects seek to eliminate the ongoing encounter between Islam and Europe, as well as the evolving dynamics within and between different Islamic sects. Further research interests include the politics of belonging and identity, psychological studies, forced migration, sectarianism, and identity politics. She has previously taught several courses at SOAS, including Introduction to Political Analysis and Migration and Diaspora Politics. Her paper today is titled Unconscious Sectarianism, Rethinking Religion, Identity, and Ideology in Globalized World. So with that, to you, Emanuelle.
All right, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I hope everyone can hear me. Yes, people are nodding, so I guess that's good. So I'm going to do, my paper today is not really about desectarianization so per se, as much as an alternative paradigm for understanding sectarianism. And I suppose that could have repercussions in terms of how we understand desectarianization. Or, because if sectarianism isn't what we think it is, then desectarianization is also not what we think it is. And it's interesting that John brought up in his presentation this idea that perhaps sectarianism is not necessarily normatively bad, because this is one of the things that I'm trying to formulate an argument around the idea of sectarianism as a positive articulation of identity, or what I call the unconscious positive identity formation. So that's a little bit of a mouthful. I don't actually have a presentation to share. I do have some slides from a previous presentation that's on some empirical examples that if I have time at the end, I might share. But at the beginning, I think I want to just try and hash out these ideas that are currently still formulating in my mind, but that I hope we can have a productive discussion about. So nearly 2 decades on from the events of 9/11, and we're still very much haunted by the political and social legacy that emerged in the wake of the collapse of the Twin Towers. The war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, securitization of Islam, cultivated suspicion towards Muslims in the West, the rise of ISIS, etc., etc. They all these form part of the contemporary shape of international politics. And certainly since at least the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and certainly since the fracturing of the Arab Spring protests that since 2011 have disintegrated into infighting and civil wars, it has been common to understand much of the political and religious topography of the Middle East and wider Islamic world as part of an enduring and intractable conflict between Sunni and Shia sects of Islam. This in turn has spawned a vast academic literature on the uses and abuses of the term sectarianism. I think we would all be in agreement here today that much like other buzzwords that have come to dominate discussions of political identity and conflict, the term sectarianism has a shape-shifting quality that allows it to simultaneously explain and obscure the object of study. So sectarianism is at once an intrinsic property of ethno-religious groups, a constructed narrative of belonging, a product of discursive political power, and an empty label circulating within the globalized postmodern market for identities. And as John pointed out, there's also ontological realism in that even though sectarianism may be constructed, it then becomes real because of the way in which it is then mobilized by political actors. So to some extent, it is all of these things, and yet it is also none of them. Indeed, some scholars have gone so far as to suggest that the term be abandoned entirely. So despite the ongoing lack of scholarly consensus regarding the nature, function, and salience of sectarianism as a category of ethno-religious identity, there is somewhat of an implicit consensus regarding the normative value of sectarian identities. And that consensus is that sectarianism is bad. So one of the things I'm trying to unpick or unsettle is this normative assumption that underpins much current scholarship and policy work on sectarian identities by offering an alternative conception of sectarianism as the unconscious of positive identity formation. And I'm using this term unconscious very specifically here in a way that comes from Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, in which I try and map out a new theoretical paradigm that highlights the unconscious and affective nature of sectarian attachments, while also foregrounding the workings of ideology and desire within the contemporary social political moment. So linking sectarianism as an unconscious positive identity to other forms of identity politics that are currently circulating within our globalized world. So the term sectarianism, as I define it, should be understood as a descriptive category, one that highlights process of identity formation and mobilization in which certain kinds of in and out group identity boundaries are prioritized over others. In this way, identity discourses that work to construct the category of, say, Shia or Protestant or Serb as conceptually and empirically distinct from the category of Sunni, Catholic, Bosniak, Maronite, etc., are necessarily sectarian, no matter what their normative or emotive content. In this sense, sectarianism is less about the cultivation of intracommunal antagonisms as about the move towards the production of discrete and mutually exclusive identity categories that are undergirded by at least some sense of in-group ethno-religious commonality. So what does this mean for Lacanian psychoanalysis? So in Lacanian terms, I argue that not only should sectarianism be understood as a positive articulation of identity, or what Lacan would call the identification with the subject of discourse, and I'll get into what I mean by that in a minute, but by cultivating a critical understanding of the relationship between ideology and desire in processes of identity formation can also explain the stickiness of sectarian identity categories and why these categories resist and may even be accelerated by postmodern forms of deconstruction and the globalization of neoliberal values. So in this sense, sectarianism can be understood as akin to other forms of antagonistic identity deconstruction, such as racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, etc., and produces similar patterns of belonging, othering, and desire. This is not to say there's nothing unique about the content and functioning of sectarian identities, especially those that are invested in religiously informed political conflict, but that the ways in which sectarian identities grip or stick to individuals are a function of the universal lack at the heart of the subject identified by Lacan. So for this reason, I'm going to try and flesh out more the theoretical side of it here rather than go into the specifics of particular identity constructions, but sectarian and other identities thus constitute what Lacan would call an ideological fantasy. So I think I'm going to assume that many of you here may not be entirely familiar with Lacanian psychoanalysis, or if you are, then, well, if you are, you probably know better than I do, but but I think it would be useful to just flesh out briefly how Lacan's understanding of the social world and of identity help shed light on how sectarian identities function. So in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the unconscious is not something that is unique to an individual. So I think in Freudian psychoanalysis, we often think of the unconscious as the id or the ego. It's the Freudian slips. It's that what comes out, that individuals somehow harbor unconscious ideas. In Lacan's thinking, the unconscious is something that is shared. So the unconscious is a product of the individual's entry to the social world, which happens through language acquirement. And there is an oft-repeated dictum in Lacanian psychoanalysis that the unconscious is structured like a language. And what Lacan means by that is that by entering into language, the individual becomes sorry, my daughter's just waving at me through the window. It's definitely hard to concentrate. That the subject becomes alienated, the individual becomes alienated from their individual desires and feelings, because we have to submit to the order of language, and the order of language shares a social unconscious. So in the Lacanian reading of psychoanalysis, the unconscious itself is understood as arising through this entry to the social world, and it is thus a fundamentally social product. So what this means, if we talk about identities as being unconscious, so on the one hand, for Lacan, there is no individual. You only have the subject as the subject of discourse, the subject of the social world. The subject is not the same as the individual. There is a gap, or what he calls a lack, between the subject and the individual, because the individual always has to submit their pre-social desires to the symbolic realm, to language, to the social world, in order to become meaningful social subjects. On a conceptual level, this means that we can talk about sectarian subjects without talking about sectarian people. So this Lacanian distinction between the individual or self and the subject as the subject of discourse allows the treatment of sectarian identities that sidesteps reductionism of primordialist and constructivist accounts, while simultaneously retaining the capacity for individual agency, because an individual can choose to occupy the subject position of a sectarian subject, or they may choose not to. So there's that element of agency in there that is sometimes lacking in more, say, constructivist accounts, where individual or sectarian identities are constructed and individuals inhabit those identities. There is this, because there's this distinction between the individual and the subject, you have this gap that opens up that allows for agency. This is what forms the basis of Lacan's critique of psychological unity, and I'm not going to go into all that, but essentially what this approach offers is the possibility of studying identity the identity of, say, political actors, sectarian actors, unencumbered by problematic assumptions about themselves or their interior lives. So a Lacanian framework allows us to isolate the sectarian subject as a product of social political discourse without reducing the complexities of human subjectivity. So the sectarian subject is a placeholder, a socially constructive discursive position, which may or may not be occupied individuals at any one moment in time. This framework allows for the fluidity of individual identity, where individuals can step in and out of subject positions by alternately identifying or disidentifying with the subject of discourse, while also acknowledging the constructed, contingent, and potentially antagonistic nature of these categories. Moreover, adopting the Lacanian lens can highlight the role of the unconscious in producing, sustaining, and binding individuals to particular articulations of the sectarian subject. So as I said before, unlike the Freudian concept of the unconscious, which is understood as a facet of individual psyche and therefore fundamentally subjective in origin, the Lacanian unconscious is intimately linked to the social symbolic order and thus fundamentally collective in its manifestations. So this movement from the personal subjective to the social and intersubjective is fundamental to the understanding of unconscious desire as implicated in processes of subject formation. So the unconscious is not, as Ilan Kapur says, some hidden kernel of desire cultivated by the individual psyche, but rather an instance of discursive rupture that is reflective of symbolic desire, i.e. of the desire produced as part of the symbolic order and that is key to processes of subject formation. Production of the other, for example, the production of the in-group. So this brief outline of Lacanian theory, I hope, helps to illuminate the way in which the cohesive pre-social self, posited by both realist and constructivist theories of identities, is marked as problematic from the outset. Indeed, psychoanalysis is founded on the rejection of traditional individualist conceptualizations of the subject. So according to Lacanian theory, there is simply no self that exists prior to or outside of the symbolic realm. Rather, what exists is an ensemble of unmediated desires that are given form and substance through submission to the discursive logic of the symbolic order. So we move from an essentialist to a processual understanding of identity, where identity does not refer to some property or facet of the self, but rather to an active practice of identification with the subject. So hopefully that helps illuminate why I use Lacanian theory. I think it has this very clear conceptual tool in delineating between individuals and subjects as subjects of identity, such that you can study one without necessarily reducing all human behavior to these reductive categories. But what is so interesting about this Lacanian notion of the unconscious is the way in which desire comes into it. So because the individual is always somehow alienated by identifying with a subject, because there are these, as I said, these sort of unmediated desires that exist prior to entry in the social world, and the social world language can never fully express the full interiority of any individual. There is always a lack, there is always something missing from the articulation of identity, and yet what the identity tries to do is to fill that lack. So you have an overdetermination. There is always too much. So it's too much identity. And so the individual desires this identity because it desires to have this fullness, and yet this fullness does not exist. So I don't want to go too far down into the vulgarities of Lacanian theory, but I think when it comes to understanding sectarianism, if we look at sectarianism as an unconscious product of this desire for the fullness of identity, where individuals are identifying with these constructed sectarian subjects, which may or may not have any kind of ontological realism, then it opens up a different way of understanding sectarianism, rather than simply looking at political actors and reducing behavior to fit an ideological understanding of sectarianism. And to give some examples of this, and I will actually share my screen at this point, because I have some material from some of the work I've been doing on Shia Muslim activism in the West.
Dear Emanuelle, just keep.
Am I running out of time?
Yeah, already, but okay, you can.
Oh, am I running out of time? Okay, then never mind. Then you know what? We can do that another time. Hopefully, I've given a kind of flavor of where I'm going with the argument, and I can always bring in the empirical stuff later if, in the Q&A if people are interested.
Yes, surely. That's what I was going to remind our audience about, that Q&A down here. You can always ask our panelists whatever question you might need to ask, because these webinar sessions would go over time usually. The speaker actually would explain more than the actual seminars. So thirdly, actually we want to also thank Carnegie and Luce for their continuous support for us, and this is really held in a high esteem. So thank you very much for both organizations. Thirdly, we'll have Elias. Elias Ghazal is interested in the intersection of religion and politics in the Middle East. In particular, he is interested in exploring the politicization of religious identity. Some of the questions that he tries to answer are: how is religious identity instrumentalized, and to what effect? And why some religious political projects succeed while others fail? How can religious ideology be used for peacemaking? And what role does politics have in shaping religion? Elias' current research revolves around sectarianism in Lebanon. He's studying the agency of religious leaders vis-a-vis sectarianism. How does the religious establishment, and in particular the clergy, propagate and limit as well the spread and the devastating impact of sectarianism? In his research, Elias focuses on Shia clergy in Lebanon as they exemplify one of the most active and organized sectarian group in the country. Elias is a PhD student at Lancaster University, as well as he's a PhD fellow at CEPAD. With that, to you, Elias, please.
Let me just unshare this, set up my timer. Thank you, Iyad. Let me just share my screen. All right, I take it that my screen is visible. Yes. All right, well, thank you, Iyad, for that introduction, and for John Emanuelle for speaking to this subject. It's a lot of interesting ideas there. So, and I'm glad to be here and to be sharing my sort of work in progress on this concept of desectarianization and some of the key characteristics of it. I base my thoughts and my sort of work primarily on observing Lebanon and to lesser extent Iraq. And certainly there's a lot of information there to work off of. Now, it's common to point to sectarianism as the root cause of troubles in many countries of the Middle East. Yet we know that this term sectarianism has been problematized both as a descriptive concept and as a socio-political phenomenon, that it's difficult to know what one means. The term has become loaded with so many meanings. It's difficult to ascertain sort of a specific way of moving beyond that. And, picking up from the primordialist, instrumentalist, constructivist debate on sectarianism, one thing is clear is that this is a complex phenomenon with various internal and external forces and factors that shape sectarian identity and its relationship to politics. So, with this sort of caveat, and with sectarian identity being so elusive, what does it mean to speak of desectarianization? And certainly there are a lot of thoughts, and I'll be sharing some of what I'm thinking of, what I'm working on. And in trying to understand desectarianization, conceptually, I build on the work of the Copenhagen School and the sectarianization thesis by Hashemian Postel. And I see that desectarianization recognizes sectarian identity as a referent object that political actors try and securitize for their political gain. It also, desectarianization acknowledges that this manipulation of sectarian identity as a discursive process is aimed at regime survival in many of the divided societies. So from that perspective, and broadly speaking, desectarianization is a process that is concerned with disentangling sectarian identity from political machination. It seeks to depoliticize sectarian identity. It does not seek to cancel or get rid of sectarian identity. Rather, it recognizes the salience of the sectarian identity, and it aims to create an environment where that identity is not a cause for political instability or societal division. I think it's helpful to think of desectarianization as a normative project. And here, sort of, I'm coming out clean with how my views on sectarianism and where I think we should do with it. But by speaking of desectarianization as a normative project, what I mean is that desectarianization concedes that political co-optation of sectarian identity is a good tactic for wielding power, but in the long run, or it presupposes that sectarian politics adversely fragments society. It dilutes notions of common good or national interest, and it genuinely impedes state building. So desectarianization is about taking steps to reverse that trajectory. It's about reaching a state where mobilization along sectarian lines is an ineffective strategy for amassing political power. As a process, desectarianization is driven by an imagined desectarianized state, where securitizing actors see identity securitizing sectarian identity does not lead to taking extraordinary measures to defend that identity. It's about reaching that state where appealing to sectarian identity or sectarian solidarity is not politically, does not pay political dividends. So it's about creating the environment where, yes, you have an option to mobilize people along sectarian line, but you choose not to do that because it doesn't yield, it doesn't pay back. And while it's not possible to control or limit the capacity of sectarian entrepreneurs to operationalize sectarian fears for political gain, it is possible. And what desectarianization should aim for is to de-weaponize sectarian identity. What I mean by that is it's to create narratives and facilitate conditions that minimize the efficacy of campaigning along narrow sectarian terms. Desectarianization is about decreasing the primacy of sectarian identity when it comes to associating with political projects. Ultimately, it's about reducing the influence of sectarian fears and projections on shaping political life. So this whole, project of desectarianization is, accepts that there will always be sectarian entrepreneurs, accepts, deals with the complexity of sectarian identity and its formation, but saying, how can we make sort of politicians use an active use of sectarian identity less potent, less effective. So from that perspective, desectarianization can be seen as a reactive and a proactive process. It's reactive in the sense that it's triggered by the outbreak of exclusionary practices of sectarian ordering that discriminates against people and disregards their equality and their competencies. It is essentially about offering a counter narrative. It's exposing political practices and power structures that favor sectarian interests over national interest. But it goes beyond rejecting them. This is where desectarianization becomes active or proactive. It goes beyond rejecting them to offer alternative discourse to political organization vis-a-vis sectarian identity. So it's not content with just critiquing sectarianism and what it does, but it goes to offer other options. And so while it is reactive in that sense, it's not passive. It's not, like I said, content with merely critiquing sectarian system. It's not anti-sectarian per se in that it rejects sectarian politicking, although it certainly contains elements of that. Instead, desectarianization is a process that offers alternatives to divisive understandings of sectarian identity, to political organization and the interaction between the two together. So desectarianization is sort of positive, forward-looking, rather than just a critique of the system. So how shall we understand or analyze desectarianization? So we can see that the fragmentation or the fragmentic effect that sectarian systems have on civil society, it makes desectarianization a protracted and chaotic process. That is, sectarian politics produce incongruent communities that are more aware of their differences than what they have in common between them, whether that's sort of national interest or whatnot. And this siloing of communities, in addition to or because of, or perhaps as a result of, structures that primarily serve narrow sectarian interests, reduce spaces of intersectarian engagement. And as long periods of time, and as a consequence, the capacity to organize and reimagine a sectarian identity in public life is limited. That space where you can sort of work where sectarian identity fits gets limited because of continuous sectarianization. So after that, the authority's determination to crush or neutralize any existential threat to its sectarian-based power grip, and you end up with a resilient sectarian system, as John was saying earlier, and it's a system that is guarded by well-resourced political class that see this as a survival. And when this happens, and when sort of sectarianism becomes sort of disenfranchising, the disenfranchised public try to challenge that, and they do this by various desectarianization acts. But they're often, and because of the nature of the sort of fragmented society, these acts are random, not random, but sort of asynchronous. They're not coordinated, and they fail to produce the necessary momentum force to make a change or to bring about a lasting change to the system. So this lack of coordination and reprisal action from the state dissipate the sectarianization effort. Nonetheless, and there's a positive side to this, division and the division and deterioration that sectarian systems beget keep disaffected people from yearning for systemic change So people are always dissatisfied with the whole sectarian status quo because, you know, they're deprived. So as sectarianization intensifies, so do feelings of frustrations and discontent, which invariably feed desires and motivation for change. From that perspective, it is helpful to view disparate desectarianization efforts as part of a grand movement, a movement that shadows sectarianization as its antithesis. Desectarianization efforts may be haphazard, but they are connected over space and time by the impetus that generates them. In other words, sectarianization engenders desectarianization. And, you know, this includes all sort of, you know, the terms that, you know, could mean anti-sectarianism, unsectarianism, and so on. So for that reason, you know, seeing desectarianization as sort of as a byproduct of sectarianization, it's useful to approach this concept of desectarianization as a continuum. Desectarianization acts in the past inform future ones, and future desectarianization acts build on the outcome of historical ones. Here, collective memory plays an important role in fueling desectarianization, just as it does for sectarianization. While desectarianization may be implemented as a top-down or bottom-up process, it is typically driven by bottom-up processes, by the grassroots who are most disaffected with the sectarian status quo. And it manifests itself in various uncoordinated acts that give a common goal for reimagining the place of sectarian identity in the public realm. These sectarianization acts look different across time and space, and they are predicated on the context in which they appear. Desectarianization in Lebanon is different than desectarianization in, say, in Iraq. The governing system is different, or it might be different than in sort of in other states where it's more authoritarian. Here it's, you know, to bring in the whole notion of power sharing. It's possible to see, and we sort of, John alluded to this already, you know, when it comes to desectarianization, there's sort of two ways about going about it, at least. It could be sort of from within the system, or to challenge it from outside. So looking at the 2019 uprisings in Lebanon recently, a few months ago, after the protesters managed or succeeded in forcing the Hariri government to resign, there was a sort of a split or a schism between people on the next course of action. Should they try and you know, force change from within by bringing an electoral law, a non-sectarian electoral law, or by trying to you know, just install a government, an independent government that has sort of extrajudicial privileges to institute a new non-sectarian order. And, you know, things turn out differently at the end. So that sort of, you know, is a sort of a way of trying to look at desectarianization, understand it, conceptualize it. And just as an example to look at what this looks like in action, maybe, I'll briefly try and apply this to the situation in Lebanon. Lebanon, you know, is the example par excellence of sectarianism gone wrong, if I may say. And we see that, you know, historically Lebanon had this, you know, consociationalism system of power sharing. You know, it led, or maybe it's, you know, one of the reasons that led to the infighting that, you know, marked 15 years civil war in the country, which was not civil at all. But the civil war ended with a Taif agreement. And this Taif agreement, you know, although it ended the fighting, didn't end the sort of the war between the different factions. But what I'm arguing for, what I'm trying to say is that, you know, it's possible to view the post-Ta'if period, post-war, post-Ta'if Lebanon, this period from 1990 till our present time, as a sort of desectarianization period. And that, you know, there's a reason why, you know, it picks up from there. You know, you could go back further, but the Ta'if Accord made changes to the constitution, some amendment that legislate and, you know, constitute, put in writing as a system, an approach to trying and you know, put steps towards a desectarianized order. So whether that's true, whether that's through an electoral law or some other means. I'll conclude by pointing to sort of different instances where that thing happened, or over the period. After 1990, it was a new system, and the war had ended. It took some time for people to realize, you know, what's happening on the ground in terms of power sharing. But we see that in 1997 there was a sort of they called the Revolution of the Hungry. It started in Baalbek by former Secretary General of Hezbollah, and it was a movement to protest against the government and against the deprivation that the system caused to people on the periphery. That didn't lead to much because there was strong Syrian presence at the time. But you know, the things changed in 2005 after the assassination of Hariri. The Syrians were driven out. At that point, we see a number of sort of NGOs forming and calling for, you know, a new non-sectarian order in Lebanon. Still nothing happened. We're still where we are. 2011, Lebanon experienced some movements that people on the streets, they marched, they called for a new non-confessional order in Lebanon. It didn't have a big impact, arguably because, you know, all the scene was divided by the Cedar Revolution. 2015, you know, there was the Use Think movement. This was a big sort of movement that led to the present, what's happening right now, the ongoing sort of revolution of October 2019. I'll conclude by saying that all these movements, important to look at these sort of different stages, not as key moments. They're not the only sort of moments. And you know, the small events that happen here and there, you know, the formation of certain parties, labor strikes, the formation of different groups, all these coalesce and come together to sort of head and put sort of a direction towards desectarianization. And it's important to look at all these things as a continuum to try and understand what's happening in Lebanon. I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. Actually, learned a lot just by hearing the description of different levels of analysis that you just applied to this case. Our fourth speaker today is Kirstine Rønn. Anne is a PhD student at the Department of Political Science at Aarhus University. Her research focuses on how civil society can contribute to desectarianized socio-political life in divided societies. In her dissertation, she looks into the various strategies that anti-sectarian social movements in Lebanon and in Bosnia use to oppose sect-based politics and to promote political communities that transcend sectarian divides. With an offset in social movement theory, she investigates how choices of forming movements and organization and continuous repertoires impact processes of mobilization and demobilization and movement development. And Kirstine holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Copenhagen and a master's degree in international studies from Aarhus University. Academically, she has a great interest in intercommunal conflict, identity politics, and social movements in non-democratic settings, and Middle Eastern international relations as well. With that, to you, AK, please go ahead.
Wow, thank you, Ayat. And thank you to the panelists we've heard so far. Thank you to John, Emanuelle, and Elias for really splendid presentations. I'm just going to share my screen and then see whether it works with the PowerPoint. Okay, I think here we go. Yes, can everyone see my screen? Good. Brilliant. Yes, so you can see my title is What is so anti-sectarian about anti-sectarian protest? And this title is inspired by a paper which was published by my colleague and supervisor Morten Valbjørn, which was entitled What's so sectarian about sectarian politics? So the starting point of Morten's paper was that we kept hearing about the rise of sectarian politics in the Middle East, but it was not really clear what was so distinctively sectarian about these politics. And my starting point is somewhat similar. I argue we're beginning to see scholars and observers talking about the emergence of anti-sectarian actors and initiatives. And we're also seeing people and movements in the Middle East and beyond who present themselves as challenges to sectarianism. So this anti-sectarianism is a form of stance against sectarianism, but what exactly does it mean? So as the title says, I will focus on protests against sectarianism, and more specifically, I'll look at the recent example, which is the Lebanese uprising that began on October 17 last year. Good. So this is a picture I took in central Beirut about 6 months ago, and it shows a caravan led by students from the Lebanese University with a banner reading "No to the sectarian system." And this one is a photo of a wall in Tripoli with the same message. So clearly there's something anti-sectarian about the Lebanese protests. But in this presentation, I'm going to present two main arguments that might get us a bit closer to understanding how and why this October Revolution can be seen as anti-sectarian. Good, so these are my two main arguments. The first argument is that the uprising represents a particular form of anti-sectarianism out of a variation of different approaches, which we might call anti-sectarian. And the second argument I'm going to present is that the protests are not purely anti-sectarian. In fact, there's also something sectarian about them, which coexists with the anti-sectarian. Good. So my presentation will consist of two parts. In the first part, I'll show how we can use some of the existing conceptual work to identify which forms of anti-sectarianism we saw in the Lebanese protests. And in the second part, I'll look at some specific messages and events from the uprising and show how and when we see this interaction between the sectarian and the anti-sectarian elements. Good. So what is this anti-sectarianism? Well, I think it's very hard to talk about anti-sectarianism without touching on the concept of sectarianism, which, as Emanuelle pointed out, suffers from a notorious lack of definitions and has given researchers a lot of headache. But I do think there are some good attempts out there to disentangle the concept, and one of them is worked out by some of my colleagues at the SWA project, and it distinguishes between three forms of sectarianism. So the first form is banal sectarianism, which is the everyday local manifestations of religious or communal identities. That could, for instance, be the idea that your children should marry someone from the same sect. Then there is instrumentalized sectarianism, which is the politicization of sectarian differences for instrumental ends, which can also be called political sectarianism. And lastly, there is radical sectarianism, which is when groups seek to impose a true interpretation of religion in the public sphere. So this is when it becomes about doctrines suddenly, and ISIS is a good example of that. So I argue that the Lebanese protests were mainly directed against the second form of sectarianism, the instrumentalized form. That is, there were a critique of the political and economic system in Lebanon rather than a call to consider people's private sect-based identities or a call against religiously motivated violence. I mean, to be fair, this is not a revolutionary finding that will secure my academic career. It is, in fact, pretty obvious since Lebanon is a textbook example of instrumentalized sectarianism. So I guess what's more interesting to discuss is the degree to which the protests targeted instrumentalized sectarianism. So in other words, why should they be understood as protest against a sectarian system and not just a bad system? Why are they not protests against corruption and poor social conditions, just like the mass protests we saw in Chile taking place about the same time? So there is clearly a huge focus on corruption and economic hardships in the Lebanese protests. And I do think we should be very careful to call any protests that is against corruption an anti-sectarian protest just because it takes place in a sectarian setting. But that being said, I would argue that there is an underlying narrative in the Lebanese October uprising which explicitly connects the systemic corruption on the one hand with instrumentalized sectarianism. And this narrative stressed that the system in Lebanon had survived exactly because of its ability to keep the Lebanese divided, and in that sense also prevent them from rising up against it. One example of this is the phrase that was shouted from the stages in Malta Square 6 months ago, and sort of roughly translated, "You've been dividing us for 30 years, now it's time for us to unite against you." Yeah, so now we've established what form of sectarianism the protests were against. But the next thing I'm going to look at is the strategic and rhetorical approaches that were used in the protests. So just like there are different types of sectarianism that we might usefully distinguish between, we can also argue that there are different ways to counter sectarianism. And my colleague Mabon has argued that challenges to sectarianism or desectarianism strategies can follow sort of 3 different paths. The first path, or the first strategy, is called the all that we share strategy. It's basically a focus on factors that unite people across sects. That could be a national identity, for instance. And so the second strategy is to create alternative cleavages that sort of overrule the sectarian. For instance, the cleavage between the people on the one hand and the regime on the other hand. And the third strategy is to promote cooperation across sects while still recognizing the sect-based identities, and that could be arguing for sect-based quotas, for instance. So I would say, in the case of the Lebanese uprising, that we can mainly identify 2 of these 3 desectarianization strategies. And so the first one is the all that we share approach that can be seen with the emphasis of a shared Lebanese national identity. For instance, by displaying the flag and singing the national anthem, as you see in the picture on the right hand. And the second strategy that we saw very clearly in the uprising was this creation of an alternative cleavage, pitting the people against the political and economic elites. This is what we saw exemplified with the slogan "Sha'b yurid isqat an-nizam ta'ifi," the people want the downfall of the sectarian regime. But we also saw it in a way that the protesters talked about the elites as a class in itself, the corrupt sectarian political class, as they said. So to sum up, as I said, my first argument is that the Lebanese uprising represents particular forms of what we can call anti-sectarianism. And what I've shown so far is that by using some of the existing conceptual framework, we can say that we're dealing with a protest movement which poses a relatively explicit critique against instrumentalized sectarianism, and that it does so by using 2 different strategies: uniting protesters under a shared Lebanese identity, and by creating a cleavage between the people and the elites. So, to my second argument, which is that there's also something sectarian about the anti-sectarian protests that sort of coexists with the anti-sectarianism. So generally, the broad social demands that were raised in the Lebanese uprising also resonated with people who were supporters of sectarian parties or felt compelled to remain loyal to these parties because they owed specific politicians favors or votes, and so on and so forth. So that is, there were some demands and slogans in the protest that were somewhat compatible with the sectarian outlook, while other claims and other demands were not. So one message that was not compatible with the sectarian outlook, I argue, was the killun yani killun, all of them means all of them. That was a main chant in the protest that sort of stressed that the entire elite was equally Rønn. And it was a clear example also of the cleavage between the people and the regime. So I would argue that this slogan should be understood as inherently sectarian, anti-sectarian. So first of all, because it rejects the idea that you can distinguish between the elites based on their sect and position or achievement or whatsoever. And secondly, because of the way that it was used, as I also elaborate in my paper in the special issue of Faith and International Affairs. So the slogan Killun yani Killun gained a lot of traction during the 2015 protests. And the activists I interviewed for my research about these protests told that the slogan also served kind of deliberately to prevent the protests from becoming sectarianized. So with Killun yani Killun, it was no longer possible to spare the leaders of a particular sect-based constituency. And when people in the crowds started chanting things that were had a sectarian bias, other people around them would start chanting Killun yani Killun in order to stop that. And this is also what we saw in the recent protests. Good. So some of the messages and actions that were somewhat compatible with sectarian outlook were what I can call targeted attacks, sort of, for lack of a better term. These were protests or slogans or actions that were sort of directed against specific institutions or members of the ruling elites. So after Hariri resigned, we began to see increasing mobilizations around these particular institutions, such as the electricity companies, the telecommunication offices, and especially also the central bank. What we also saw was that there were protests that rejected the candidates for the prime minister post that came up. We had the nomination, the candidacy of Samir Khatib and Mohammed Safadi, both of whom withdrew. And then afterwards, the nomination of Hassan Diab as the new prime minister, who formed a government in January this year. And this also sparked specific protests that rejected the nomination of these people. So let me just highlight two examples of how these targeted attacks became sort of meeting points between the sectarian and the anti-sectarian. So the first example is the banks. We had protests that broke out in January, in mid-January this year, that were specifically, targeting the banks. And there was one specific incident where the shop windows of the banks were broken in Hamra, in the Hamra neighborhood of Beirut. So these protests in Hamra against the banks were initiated by leftist groups such as the Communist Youth and the political grassroots organization Mihaqi. But there were also people there who were supporters of Harakat Amal and Hezbollah, and who used explicitly sectarian chants there, such as Shia Shia. And the activists I have interviewed about this incident in Hamra, they tend to disagree about how much the supporters of Amal and Hezbollah actually took part in the smashing of the banks. But they nevertheless point out that there was some kind of common enemy here, that we were having the same kind of protest action, smashing the banks, but it was being done from two different perspectives or with two different motivations. So the leftist activists attacked the banks, obviously, because they were an influential part of the sectarian elites. So in other words, this was just another way for them to express the killon yani killon phrase. Meanwhile, for the supporters of Amal and Hezbollah, smashing these banks was a way to express their economic and social grievances, but in a way that was somewhat in line with the stance of their sectarian leaders. In fact, Hassan Nasrallah had been out criticizing the Lebanese banking sector repeatedly for making life hard for small depositors who couldn't get their money out of the banks, for instance. So the second example of a targeted attack that sort of unites the sectarian with the anti-sectarian is the protest against the newly formed government led by Hassan Diab, which also took place in January, by the way. So as one activist put it, these protests were attended by both the Saura guys, the revolution guys, and the Hariri guys, the supporters of Future Movement. And these people all claimed that the new government was illegitimate, but they did so for different reasons. The anti-sectarian reason was that the government did not represent the people and was not the technocratic government that the protests had called for since the beginning. Whereas the sectarian narrative, the sectarian motivation, was that it was unfair that Hariri had stepped down due to the revolution while his opponents remained in power and now formed a new government. So in other words, this was an unfair treatment of the Sunnis. Good. I sense that I'm running out of time now. Yes. Yeah, you're nodding. So I'm just going to put one final point, which is that obviously this can seem dangerous for what we can call anti-sectarian protests, the fact that they are inherently also sectarian elements in them. But actually what I have heard from activists that I have interviewed is that it's not per se a huge threat. And they give two main arguments for that. The first argument is that as long as there's a common enemy, it's better somehow to be many people in the streets and sort of keep the protests going. And the second argument they have is that it's important to understand that people who are supporting or at least have reservations against some of these sectarian leaders are poor and oppressed. So there's a sense of awareness about the intersectionality between sectarianism and class in Lebanon, which also makes it hard to just reject people who do not dare to criticize the sectarian leaders simply because they might be so poor that they can't afford to do so. This obviously raises a lot of different questions and points to a lot of different further research questions. And I wish I had time to elaborate on some of these, but I hope that we can take them up in the Q&A, at least some of them. But thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, AK. Actually, that was a brilliant presentation and really in touch with the grassroots and with people on the ground. So we got really 4 different presentations that cover, different realms of issues. So that we are very lucky. We have also Simon Mabon today joining us in the form of discussant. So he'll be discussing what you all presented today. As you'll know, Simon is the director of CEPAD. His work falls at the intersection of Middle East studies, international relations, and international political theory. He is particularly interested in sovereignty and its discontents, space, nomos, along with the empirical manifestations of these issues. He is the director of CEPAD, the Sectarianism, Proxies, and Desectarianization project, funded by Carnegie Corporation. His book, Saudi Arabia and Iran, Power and Rivalry in the Middle East, published in 2013, have had a huge impact, I can say also on me personally, on the discussion of the international relations of the Middle East. Recently, Simon's book, Houses Built on Sand, Violence, Sectarianism, and Revolution in the Middle East, was published by Manchester University Press in early 2020, so you can get it already out. The second one, The Struggle for Supremacy, Saudi Arabia and Iran, will be published by Cambridge University by 2021. With that, to you, Simon.
Thank you, Iyad. Very kind of you to say such extensive introductory remarks. I must apologize for switching my camera off intermittently. I've just come down with cramp in my leg. It's perfect timing, just as I'm about to be speaking. So if you hear yelps of pain anywhere, please just forgive me. Thank you for those wonderful papers. I've got a whole page of notes here that I'm not going to read out because I think it's time to hear a bunch of questions from the floor. But I think there are a couple of points that I would like to just stress. And I think on one of the last slides that you put up, AK, there was the quote, "As long as there's a common enemy, it's better to be many people in the streets." And that really struck me, that there's, if we're going to reflect on the fundamental aspects of desectarianization, it strikes me that we are trying to reflect on ordering, on political order, ideas of political community, ideas of community more broadly, questions of inclusion and exclusion, who is going to be a part of the political project and who is not. And that sense of a common enemy seems to be absolutely central to that, even if there are other levels of divisions that may cut across society. And it strikes me that if we're talking about desectarianization, we're talking about reimagining order, reimagining those divisions between people, reimagining where the schisms should be or could be, and reimagining how politics can order life either in accordance with some of these schisms or trying to circumvent some of these schisms. It strikes me that fundamentally, when we're reflecting on questions about desectarianization, we're looking at the reordering of life, the reimagining of life, the ways in which the possible becomes realized, the imagined becomes actualized. Now, that of course points to the contingencies involved here, both in terms of the imaginaries of those involved, but also the complexities of time and space. And so the imaginaries of someone in Lebanon are going to be dramatically different to the imaginaries of someone in Bahrain, let's say. The imaginaries of someone in 1970s Lebanon, racked by what Elias, I think, appropriately termed an uncivil war, are going to be dramatically different to the imaginaries of the Lebanese today. So I think that temporal dimension is absolutely key, as is the spatial dimension, as is the question about agency and imaginary. And I really like John's idea about the intersectional. And as you were talking about that, John, I flagged up and jotted down on my notes, intersectional. And I spelt it slightly differently because I think the intersectional is also intersectional. And I'll just elaborate on that. I think that there's a very clever play on words there that you've probably articulated, that there are political dimensions within sects that is intersectional, right? But there's also the point that what you were flagging up, the economic, the political, the cultural, the civil society, is intersectional, right? So there's an intersectional set of issues that play out within sects and across sects. So the intersectional is intersectional, which I thought was actually really quite important, because desectarianization is intersectional. It's not, as I've argued elsewhere, and so has Morten and other members of the panel have argued, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all process here. There's not just one sort of top-down approach that can be used. There's a whole host of different issues, processes, strategies, goals, aspirations, actors, failures, successes. And I think untangling all of these is incredibly difficult, but it's important. And that's what we're trying to do here. And I think one of the things that is really important and really useful for these projects is to draw comparisons. To draw comparisons across the Middle East, because what's happening in Lebanon is different to Iraq, even though there are many similarities. And what's happening in Lebanon and Iraq are different to what happened in Bahrain, for example. And what happened in Bahrain is different to examples outside of the Middle East, in terms of Northern Ireland, in terms of Bosnia, in terms of what's happening in India, for example. There's a whole host of examples that we can draw upon. to reflect on ways in which the role of religion and the politicized role of religion playing out across all aspects of life has been reimagined, has been contested, and the way in which people are operating within this. And I think that that's where we really need to push these discussions forward. We need to start thinking about comparative case studies that will allow us to reflect on the who, the what, the why, the where, the when, and the how, because that's going to be how we can really learn about these processes of desectarianization as a broad umbrella term. And I think that hints at what Elias was getting at, in that there aren't necessarily just these big acts of desectarianization. It's not that we should just look at, say, the 2019 protests or the garbage crisis as acts of desectarianization, but there's ongoing processes. There's the minutiae, the everyday resistance, as James C. Scott talks about, the ways in which people are engaging in these processes of desectarianization on a daily basis, on a granular level, trying to perhaps deactivate certain structures within life that will allow them to reimagine a political future. And this is where I think Emanuelle's presentation was fascinating. I'm not a Lacanian, but I'm learning a lot. And it strikes me that there is this unconscious that you're talking about in terms of sectarianism. And then I wonder if the same thing applies to desectarianization, this unconscious collective. But then if that's the case, what might that look like? What might an unconscious desectarianization look like? Because it strikes me that if there is something that can bring people together, that could serve as the unconscious. It may just be as broad as an aspiration for a better life, but I don't know, perhaps that's something that you could elaborate on, Emanuelle, given that you are far more of a Lacanian than I. But I think what I've tried to just point out here is that there's a whole host of complex issues playing out, and we need to be very careful that we don't just paint with a broad brush here when we're talking about desectarianization or anti-sectarianism or non-sectarianism or counter-sectarianism or post-sectarianism or however we choose to use labels. We need to be very, very careful with terminology. We need to be careful to paint with a very fine brush so that we're not reproducing some of the issues that have helped sectarianization find traction, or that have provided inaccurate or problematic analysis of these events. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone. I thoroughly enjoyed the papers. I've really enjoyed this panel. Again, I've learned a hell of a lot, as I always do when listening to such wonderful scholars. So thank you very much, Ed.
Thanks a lot, Simon, for such great insights on the presentations that we had. So we have in the QA section a huge engagement actually over here. So do you guys want to go ahead and answer the questions that you are engaged with already, or should I read them to you? And I'll start with Emanuelle, actually, if you may. Yeah, you're muted. All right.
Am I unmuted? Yes. Sorry, did you want me to read out the question and respond, or?
Because you already responded to them.
I have already responded.
Yeah, which one you want to respond, or if you don't want to respond to?
I think there were a couple of questions that asked about my empirical work, so perhaps I could very briefly talk about that, because I think it illuminates some of the theory can sometimes be a bit dense, and it can be easy to get lost if you're not a Lacanian, but I think the empirical example could have helped ground what exactly I mean. And what I've been working on most recently is forms of Shia Muslim activism in Europe. Actually, it's global, but I've specifically been focusing on Europe, and what I call the discourse of Shia rights. So this is an ensemble of individuals, grassroots organizations, and general discourses that are circulating often online, but also that often form part of visible manifestations of Shia religious practice in European cities. For example, the Ashura marches in London, where a lot of these grassroots organizations will be present. And there is this broader discourse of this idea that, and which may or may not be, you know, I'm not going into the facts of the matter, but the discourse being that Shia Muslims have been victimized throughout history. There is this narrative coming from the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, which was at the Battle of Karbala, which is one of the main Shia commemorations that happens every year, and a sort of trans-historical narrative that links this historical victimhood and marginalization with contemporary forms of victimhood and marginalization of Shias around the world. And there is even an organization called Shia Rights Watch, which models itself on Human Rights Watch and publishes annual, actually quarterly reports of Shia rights violations around the world. And what I find so interesting about this discourse is the way it very much consciously uses these ideas that are, you know, the idea of replicating Human Rights Watch and talking about the UN Charter on Human Rights and bringing in discourses of equality and justice and minority representation, which are all things we can be on board with, and how this is a very positive and emancipatory identity. It's a way of trying to give a voice to the Shia that have historically been oppressed. And yet the flip side of that is that there has to be an other against whom this positive Shia identity is being articulated, and that has most recently been the figure of ISIS. So this idea that, you know, those are the bad Muslims, they're all the ones killing people, and we are the Shia and we are oppressed. And this is what I would call the unconscious sectarianism. So it's not that this positive identity is intentionally producing a sectarian. You know, it's very much it's an emancipatory narrative. It's a coming out narrative. It's a, you know, we want to stand up and be represented. And yet you necessarily, if you have a production of a more concrete and a more discursively coherent Shia identity that is grounded in the idea of equality and justice, then that necessarily means that the non-Shia, the Sunni Muslim, is unjust. And this is what I would call this unconscious sectarianism.
Thank you very much, Emanuelle. That's a very clarifying answer. Can
I ask a question?
Go ahead, Simon. Yeah,
please. There's been a lot of talk about processes today, but I wonder if we can hear from other members of the panel about any successes, how they might identify a success story of desectarianization. Now, I'm not projecting a normative claim onto a success being a good or a bad thing, but in terms of what they might identify as a successful act of desectarianization, please. Because I think that might be really useful to help shed a bit more light on what's going on here. Thank you.
I can think of one example, Simon. Yeah, if I may, yes.
Yeah, please, and thank you. So please.
So in the Lebanese context, looking at at least since 2015, the You Stink movement, the whole garbage crisis, led to the emergence of a political party that is atypical from the rest of the parties. This is a sort of a trans sectarian party. Its members it's openly non-sectarian. I mean, all the other parties claim to be non-sectarian, most of them, not all of them. But there's one group, political party called Hizb Sab'a, that actually, I think, put forward a modern form of political parties that can be an example to lead sort of the charge of desectarianization. People, have an option now to choose to vote for a party that is not openly aligned with one of the major sects, Sab'a being sort of trans-sectarian. And another one like it is the Beirut Madinati, which are both sort of political groups. Beirut Madinati is they contested the Beirut elections, and they all came so close to winning many of the seats there. But I think this is proper successful desectarianization, because it gives people's options. It creates conditions that help people to move away from the traditional sectarian parties and can pave the way, can encourage and inspire the other parties to actually campaign along, clear visions rather than just, personality cults and other sort of histories of people who have fought the other parties.
Yeah, AK, I think you have a point regarding this as well. And then we'll go to John.
Yes, Elias, I think it was very interesting that you brought up the Sabah party as an example, because I think the Sabah party is actually also an example of some of the dangers that are associated with creating these alternatives. So in some of the research I've been doing over the past half year, I've been interviewing activists from different parts of the activist environment that are driving these new organizations, primarily based in Beirut. And actually the Sabah party is the actor that many of these actors sort of highlight as a movement which is not kind of driving things in a good direction. And what they say is that the Sabah party is too neoliberal for them, which also means that among these actors that are trying to translate, the grievances against the sectarian system into a political project, there's a huge division about the sort of more political, ideological questions. And this is why I think that we should be very careful to understand that this is not a coherent group of new actors. There's huge disagreement among these actors, and the Sabah party is perhaps an example of a party or of an organization which is really even hated by some actors. Like there are many who distinguish themselves from Sabah and would rather not work with them at all.
Right. John, do you like to comment on this point or go to the question that was posed in the Q&A?
Sure. Maybe I can try to deal with both aspects. I'm not going to go down a road of trying to identify successes for movements. I think that's kind of down for kind of activists themselves. However, I think we need to do more analysis of what we mean by kind of social movement outcomes. What are the kind of short to medium term effects of these movements? However, I think a really important question for us to kind of ask is, if somebody goes out into the street and starts to kind of protest about their living situation, to kind of demand for jobs, for gender equality, rights for kind of sexual minorities, what are these people actually kind of demanding beyond these particular issues? Are they really demanding the end to the sectarian system? Do they have in their mind something along the lines of Francis Fukuyama's, moving towards some sort of kind of liberal democracy, and they want to get to kind of Denmark? Of course, there's nothing wrong with Denmark, but I don't think that's what's in the minds of kind of people who go into the streets. However, I think we can see this in terms of a process of systematically kind of challenging the sectarian system, because I think kind of these people kind of realize that the sectarian system actually kind of produces all of these types of inequalities, and that these kind of multiple forms of contestation may actually lead to kind of sustainable kind of change. So the question is, what do all of these kind of types of kind of campaigns kind of add up to? And this is an area in which we need a kind of lot more kind of systematic kind of research, because, I don't think the question is whether it's going to lead into the end of kind of sectarian system, but the question is, what do people actually kind of want from engaging in these sort of campaigns? What is the kind of end goal? Is it just about achieving economic, improvements to their kind of everyday life, or is it something actually much more kind of systematic towards this? But if we are to go down the road to think about kind of social movement successes, then it is in terms of these kind of micro campaigns. When you think about how successful movements have been in terms of kind of privatization of public space in Beirut in the last kind of few years, somebody was telling me that some of these movements have actually stopped something like $2 billion worth of kind of privatization. When you think about the role of kind of sexual minority LGBT activists in relationship to making sure that the state can't actually sentence them to go to prison, so all of these things are incredibly kind of powerful forms of kind of resistance, not just in terms of these sort of micro campaigns, so that's the appropriate word, but actually in, coming towards a process of challenging the sectarian system. And what's more important is to think about moments of molecularity, to use the term used by Deleuze and Guattari. It's when movements actually, all of these kind of varied movements come together and realize that in different ways the sectarian system generates these multiple forms of inequality, and that in order to kind of create a sustained form of challenge, that there needs to be kind of coordinated thinking. So that's why sometimes maybe kind of successors, Think, or the November uprisings in Lebanon, it's those moments of molecularity where movements come together and begin to kind of figure out how all of these different kind of issues are connected.
Thank you, John. I think we're going to Emanuelle. You have a point, or?
Well, I was going to actually, if I may be permitted, respond to Simon's comment in the notes about this idea of the collective desectarianization. Sorry. Sally, Mummy's working.
No.
And sorry, guys. And this is the vagaries of childcare with working from home. And I think an interesting thing about having the Lacanian approach is this idea that sectarianism comes from the way in which identities are created, and therefore the only way you could have a desectarian unconscious, I suppose, would be if you had more fluid identities. If you, rather than this production of these very discrete identity categories and this
Mummy.
Nice.
Right, sorry.
All right.
Mommy.
I think you might have to get someone else.
Go for a second, that's all right.
Shall I step in for a second?
Yeah, go ahead, Simon, that's all right.
That's so sweet. Oh, I love that. I just wanted to offer a slightly negative take on it. I mean, there's all this talk of social movements, which is wonderful, and there's that sense that change can be brought about from the bottom up. And I'm not in any way projecting a normative issue here, anything like that. But I would argue that there has been a number of successful examples of desectarianization in terms of sovereign power and the way in which states have sought to operate and to change the position of religion within political projects. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Bahraini case post 2011, when the Al Khalifa was very careful in, first of all, embarking on a process of sectarianization, as a number of people have argued, but then in the years afterwards, embarking on desectarianization. That was done through the rampant use of sovereign power, trying to regulate all aspects of life, and in a way deactivating the meaning of sectarianism, trying to reduce the stickiness of the Shia identity, reducing its resonance in political, social, community life, so that it had no meaning. And it's quite a dark process, drawing on drawing on biopolitical processes through which sovereign power plays out. And it can be all encompassing, and it resulted in the widespread devastation of Shia communities, Shia political parties, and then other forms of resistance and opposition in Bahrain. So there is a top-down element to it as well as a bottom-up. There's a power sort of mobilization dimension, as well as the social movement creativity, I guess. Just something that I wanted to throw out there, just as another way of looking at these things in a slightly different manner.
Any ideas to add? We have only 5 minutes remaining. Emanuelle, if you want to actually to add to your points or not, I'm not forcing.
It's a big dragon. Yeah. What I wanted to say was that I think in the framework that I'm proposing, the idea of sectarianism being linked to the rigid identity boundaries, to have a desectarian unconscious would have to have a more fluid understanding of identity, which goes against a lot of the way in which the world is currently moving, and I think then opens up very interesting questions about the potential how well potential desectarian projects will work if they don't address that issue. The issue of building solidarity across difference rather than reinforcing difference.
Right.
So,
okay.
yeah. But
that's
apologies for the small distraction.
It's what happens. So, John, anything to add on that point or on other points as well? Or
yeah, I mean, I think all of the examples are really kind of powerful and, you know, relevant, and what this is all pointing to is the need for more research in this area, not just about why non-sectarian movements emerge at particular moments or the strategies we use, but there's definitely a need to consider what are the sort of outcomes of these movements. And as Simon said, sometimes it can actually be a really dark story, because what it tells us is actually the kind of hegemonic power of sectarian systems to maintain themselves, unfortunately. And actually, it may not be non-sectarian actors which bring them down, but it may actually be, you know, the role of external international actors, you know, not being able to fund sectarian regimes, you know, not to kind of discourage or to minimize the work which non-sectarian movements have kind of achieved, but we need to be kind of also realistic about what they have actually achieved.
Thanks a lot.
It's actually in terms of changing attitudes, it's about chipping away at the system or whatever, you know, but yeah, more research.
Yeah.
That sounds like an excuse, doesn't it, always, just to do more research. Give me more money to do research on this and everything will be great.
Well, yeah, we need more research actually, but I don't know what is the limit of that. So,
any trouble right now, guys.
All right. Okay. Any other last points of our panelists before we go? That's very cute, Emanuelle, but that's all right. Okay, then. We'll meet up again tomorrow for our last webinar discussing the GCC and how desectarianization plays a role over there, if there is a role of desectarianization in the Gulf. With that being said, thanks to all audience and panelists, and thank you, Emanuelle, for bringing this as well. See you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.